Today, lecture 40, documentation of the description of the function of divisions and the purpose for the lecture, installation of documentation, description of function of department of employees. Glossary, write the copybook. A document is a written medium of information that certifies of essence of facts of the certain signification. General conditions are rules established by law that express the characteristics of primary invasion and define of the most essential requirement for the procedure of processing and the decision making of the stage of the process. The function of a document, it is the intended purpose inherent in the regulation of the whether users aware of the function or not. Documenting information. Information recorded a material carried with details that allow it to be identified. An employee is a subject of labor law individual who works under employment contract with the employer and receives a salary for this. Structural element of the regulation in the structural division. Title page, general provision, purpose and the main task, functions, rights, responsibility, relation with the structural until the enterprise organization. Title page. The name of the regulation should correspond to the name of the structural until specified in the staffing table of the enterprise organization and here field of activity of the unit. The text of the provision, section 1, begins on the title page of the document. Section 1. General processing purpose of the main task function. Section rights exploited written in the structural until of the enterprise organization.
Documentation can improve performance, reduce the risk of employee lawsuits, and provide powerful evidence to help an employer defend against future claims. It's quite important to understand the benefits of documentation. Documentation shapes expectations where coaching alone can be ineffective. Documentation shows an employee their chance to improve, creating a fair work environment. And if the employee doesn't take the opportunity, documentation is proof that the employer tried to provide the tools and resources for the employee to succeed and is evidence that the termination decision was not arbitrary. Despite these impressive benefits, employers frequently neglect documentation. Sometimes this happens because they do not understand or appreciate the importance of documentation. Sometimes the employer thinks documentation is simply too complicated, and other times the employer considers documentation too time-consuming. Documentation can be simple and quick if employers and managers follow these 3 rules of disciplinary documentation. Just do it, know your audience, and tell the story. Rule 1, just do it. The biggest problem for many employers is they simply do not document. So our first rule is also our simplest. Employers need to document. There are 5 critical reasons that employers need to document. First, documentation provides an opportunity for the employee to improve. Second, documentation shapes employee expectations. Third, documentation also decreases litigation. And fourth, juries expect documentation. And fifth and finally, documentation establishes legitimate business reasons for action. So our first reason is that documentation provides an opportunity for the employee to improve. At the core of performance management is communication of employers' expectations. However, many employers erroneously rely on oral warnings and coaching. But it's hard to deliver bad news to employees, and subsequently people managers universally water down the message and delivery. And the employee listening will filter the message, missing parts and mishearing others. Finally, neither person will remember the message and over time will reconstruct what was said by filling in the blanks. Documentation overcomes these challenges through a carefully crafted written message. The employee can read and is less likely to misunderstand and more able to recall the message. Through documentation, the employee has the best opportunity to improve. In the end, the goal is to help employees succeed. The better the communication, the better the chances of improved performance. Our second reason to document, it shapes employees' expectations. An employee who has not been warned in writing is more likely to be surprised when terminated, and a surprised employee is more likely to sue. Why? Because of expectations. Most employees assume they're doing well. They believe that no news is good news. If an employer terminates an employee who's never been warned of performance problems, or is only warned verbally, is far more likely to be surprised and feel angry and mistreated. The employee is also more likely to assume that there must have been some nefarious reason for the termination, and therefore the employee is more likely to consult with an employer or file a charge of discrimination. Reason number 3 to document, it decreases litigation. Documentation decreases litigation for at least 2 reasons. First, documentation shapes employees' expectations and subsequently reduces the surprise, anger, and perception of unfairness of termination. Second, if the employee considers suing, documentation provides evidence that makes the employee's case weaker and therefore less attractive to a plaintiff's lawyer. The documentation may persuade the plaintiff's lawyer that the termination was for legitimate business reasons and may decide to not pursue the case. Even if the lawyer takes the case, the documentation may affect the lawyer's valuation of the case, meaning that the lawyer may be less aggressive or settle more readily. That brings us to our fourth reason to document. Juries expect it. Employers often fear that juries may be more likely to sympathize with an employee. This fear can be well-founded, especially if the employer has failed to document. 61% of jurors say that employers need to be sent a message. 74% of jurors think that an employee should be provided fair warning before termination. And 90% of jurors said that the employer is negligent if it does not properly document performance problems. Thus, an employer that has to explain its actions to a jury will have an uphill battle if they've failed to document and warn the employee appropriately. And finally, our fifth and final reason to document. Documentation establishes action. Virtually every wrongful termination lawsuit boils down to an employee claiming that they were fired for some illegal reason. There's nothing mysterious about wrongful termination lawsuits. The employee will claim the termination was for some illegal reason, such as discrimination or whistleblowing, and the employer will claim that the employee was instead fired for lawful reasons, such as bad behavior, poor performance, or reduction in force. The employer needs evidence to support their position. Documentation that defines the problem and the associated impacts to the organization establishes this legitimate business reason for employment action. Now on to Rule 2, Know Your Audience. Disciplinary documentation has 2 audiences. Most employers focus on and write for only one audience, the employee. While the employee is the primary audience, employers often fail to recognize that they are writing for a large and equally, sometimes more important secondary audience: agencies, lawyers, judges, and jury. Because the secondary audience plays such an important role, the employer should write employee documentation for the secondary audience, not for just the employee. Writing for the secondary audience is different from writing for the employee because the secondary audience is not familiar with the situation or the employer's business. The employer's documentation must overcome this unfamiliarity in order to persuade the secondary audience by first explaining the problem and the impact. Although the employee may be familiar with what happened, the secondary audience is not. The documentation should factually describe what happened, the problem, and why it matters to the organization, the impact. And second, avoiding jargon. Again, the employer may understand internal jargon, but the secondary audience will not. Jargon will make documentation more difficult for the secondary audience to understand and therefore less persuasive. For example, An employer writing only for the employee might document as, "Last week, you failed to fill out our Form A1. Any further paperwork errors will result in discipline up to and including termination." By contrast, an employer writing for the secondary audience will explain the problem, describe the impact, and avoid jargon as follows. As you know, here at ABC, we manufacture life-saving medical devices that are implanted into the bodies of human patients to help them fight and survive potentially deadly diseases. Your job as a quality insurance inspector is to inspect each lot of devices before shipment and then record the results of your inspection on a Form A1. You have been trained on each step of this process and have even attended a course on inspection documentation 2 weeks ago. Last week, you failed to complete the required inspection Form A1 on a shipment of medical devices. As a result, we have no record that the devices were inspected, meaning that we do not know if you inspected them and if they are safe. When we asked you about this, you said you were pretty sure that you had inspected the devices and you think you just forgot to fill out the required inspection form. We are unwilling to risk the patient's health and safety based on your recollection of the inspection. As a result, we promptly recalled the entire shipment. Fortunately, we were able to recall the 10 devices before they were implanted into patients' bodies. Even though the recall was successful, it had to be reported to government regulators, caused the company negative publicity, and was costly and time-consuming. Any further performance or behavior issues, including but not limited to failing to follow procedures or fill out required paperwork, will result in further discipline, up to and including termination. Finally, Rule 3, tell the story. The most important rule of documentation is telling the story, factually describing what happened and why it matters. To tell your story in documentation, follow these 3 guidelines. First, find the facts. Second, paint a word picture. And third, don't forget the punchline. First rule of telling the story, find the facts. Storytelling requires the employer to learn the facts. Workplace investigations reduce the chance of acting on incorrect or incomplete information. While people often think of investigations as large, disruptive, and costly, many investigations consist simply of interviewing witnesses with first-hand knowledge of what happened. Basic workplace investigations require the employer talk to these witnesses to learn the facts and then give the accused the opportunity